Hi there, and welcome back to English 75B. Today, I'll be giving you a couple of notes on two very prominent 19th century African American writers. First is Booker T. Washington, second will be W.E.B. Du Bois. And they often get taught together and anthologized together because they represent different ways of looking at post-war America, especially how to integrate African Americans into American society with equity, with justice, and with as much effectiveness as possible. So first up, Booker T. Washington. So nice picture. Once again, we get this very classic frontispiece, and you see that a lot with authors who are trying to show their entry into the American literary canon and to be taken seriously. Well, women's kind of like, I don't care what you guys think. I'm going to just like dress however for it. But here he's portraying himself as a well-learned and very scholarly and serious individual. And he certainly was all of those things. So what do we need to know about him? He was born in a region of Virginia called Hales Ford. He had a slave mother and an unknown and absent white father. And it is assumed in a lot of scholarship that the owner of the plantation was in fact his father, but it was never, confirmed. Now, the Civil War ends in 1865, so at that point, he's looking into different ways for him to make a living as an emancipated African American. So he took a variety of jobs, very challenging physical jobs, working as a salt packer, a coal miner, grueling, rough work. But he also worked as a house servant as well. Not as physically grueling, but the level of attentiveness and also servility and manners in the face of people that might be rude and totally unreasonable makes this a very challenging job as well. Sorry, one of the cats was under my feet. All right, I'm back now. Now, he is a graduate of Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute in Virginia. And this was an important, what we would maybe call a vocational school. Help him learn a trade that would make him, a productive and earning member of American society. Now, he then later on became the principal of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And this was a really important agricultural and mechanical trade and teaching college. So it trained people how to be skilled farm workers and agriculturalists, how to be skilled mechanics, and also how to be educators. Now, keep in mind, this is still Jim Crow, so there are separate colleges and separate public schools for white Americans versus African Americans. And those African American schools needed African American teachers. Oftentimes, white teachers did not want to teach there for just totally messed up racist reasons, of course. But between 1890 and 1915, though, he was the most powerful and popular voice for race relations, the relationship between um, African Americans and white Americans, and how they should work better together to create a new future. Once the Civil War is over, people are just taking a breath and trying to pick up the pieces and get back together. It was a brutal, catastrophic conflict. Um, Over 600,000 Americans died in it. So good portions of the nation are in tatters. And even though there's a sense of physical reconstruction that needs to happen, there are larger issues of how African Americans and whites can live and integrate well in this post Civil War, post slavery society. Now, to talk a little bit about Booker T. Washington's style, he wrote directly and plainly for as many people as possible to understand him. And he was effective in that way. If we think back to how some of the founding fathers wrote, especially somebody like, say, Ben Franklin, you'll see some, or Thomas Paine, you'll see some similarities there. He's also great with figurative language. He talked about African Americans and whites being separate fingers on the same hand. They were separate but equal, and they all worked together. See that? Separate but equal. Again, he took a very kind of half step, moderate step, halfway measure in order to ultimately get African Americans the equity and the justice under the legal system and the social systems that they so richly deserve. Another one of his very famous pieces of figurative language is this metaphor. He says, cast your bucket where you are. In other words, don't move. You don't have to go to the north or anywhere else. Wherever you are right now, your life is like a ship. Put your bucket into the water and the water will come up sweet. In other words, it won't be salt water. It will nourish you. You can drink it. And there's no need to search anywhere else. And remember, after the Civil War, there are huge black exoduses out of the southern United States and the southern regions. They went up to the Chicago area. They went up to Detroit. They went up to New York and Maryland, Virginia, places that were far more moderate in race relations than the South was. This is not to say there was not racism in the North during these times, but it was a lot less prevalent and vocal, and certainly less violent in a lot of instances. Okay, well, buddy, give me the next one. Now, the other side of this race relation coins is W.E.B. Du Bois. You notice they're about the same age. Actually, Du Bois lived a bit longer, but they really represent this snapshot in time where prominent African American thinkers are trying to set a message forward of how African Americans can be folded into American society. He's got some great quotes. He's very quotable. One of his most famous is the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. We'll get to what that means exactly. There's a picture of him. Now, if you can notice, even by looking at their portraiture, they seem a bit different. Du Bois, at least in this picture, is painted and is, with his bow tie and soft focus, seen more of an intellectual, perhaps, than, say, a person who had his hands into the very practical experience of education and working the way Booker T. Washington did. And even if you look at their roots, you will notice that they're very different. He was educated at Fisk, which was a prominent university at the time. Harvard, most of you have heard of. University of Berlin, among other places. And he was an intellectual working on the field of sociology, a very important emerging field in its time. And I talked about this a little bit earlier, way back off when we introduced the course, is that the 19th century becomes a point of developing academic disciplines and just in a broader sense, schools of thought. Remember, psychology really starts to formalize during this period. But the idea of sociology, the idea of studying people in relationship to their social groups and how social groups work or don't work is really at the heart of what Du Bois does. And the book that puts him on the American map is The Souls of Black Folk. And it was hugely influential and also gained him an international audience. He was considered to be one of the most important and ardent, but also idealistic African American thinkers in this post-war era. Now, Why is this book so important? Because it helps lay the groundwork for the idea of how people in a minority race see themselves, or any kind of minority group. And it's still considered foundational in that sense. How do African Americans see themselves in relationship to other African Americans and to American culture at large? And everybody who's anybody has either criticized or worked off of these notions in The Souls of Black Folk. Therein, wow, I had to go real fancy there. And in this book, he also introduces really important race relation ideas called the color line and double consciousness. I'm giving you a little bit of preview there. They will be on our quiz coming up. And he worked at Atlanta University from 1897 to 1910. So he's working as a professor in a university. So in a way, you start to see the trajectories of Du Bois and Washington diverge a little bit more. But after 1910, he moves to New York and becomes the editor of a very important journal called Crisis. And this is the official journal of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And this organization works to advocate for African Americans all over the nation and to legally support them in their continuing striving towards equal treatment under the law. A hugely important organization. It's still around today. And if we're just talking on the level of ideas, Washington and Du Bois are different in that Du Bois was an idealist. And he's just kind of like, we're going to aim high and we want it now, right? He was not into these gradual steps that Washington was into. I mean, if you look back at Du Bois's and Washington's origins and youth, I mean, Washington grew up under slavery. He had a slave mother. So he was definitely more modest and kind of small-stepped in his plan. But Du Bois is having nothing of it. He's just saying, there's no reason we should have half measures. These are the laws. This is a legitimate legal case. We deserve equal treatment under the law. Nothing less will do. And he actually goes through and takes a look at the Atlanta Compromise point by point. And you will see the ways in which he is finding himself not satisfied with Washington's plan. And, you know, and Du Bois is also a universalist, saying he believes all Americans, regardless of skin color, need to be treated equally under the law and have equal rights. And he was definitely known as this tireless advocate for civil and political rights, not only in the US, but also abroad. Now, the two big definitions that we get from Du Bois are these. Let's see if I'm running out of time here. We'll try to get them in. The first one is the color line. And the way he defines that is that it's the legal separation of African Americans from other Americans during the 20th century. In other words, the law treats African Americans one way, and it treats white Americans and non-African Americans another way. And even more important, this follow-up and expansion of the definition. It's the real and tangible difference between life for African Americans and other Americans in terms of social conditions, cultural conditions, political conditions, and economic conditions. Separate is not equal for him. There is a line that separates the way America works for white Americans and the way it works or doesn't work for African Americans. Looks like we're going to hold off right here. I'm not going to get double consciousness done in 20 seconds, so sit tight. Next video coming up.